everyone, this is Ria. So if you don't know, this is part 2 of my video on Scott Young's book Ultralearning. If you have not seen part 1, please do check it out. There will be a link down below in the description, and there should be a link here in the corner. Or, continue watching this at your own peril, but it might not make much sense. I spent the first video explaining what ultralearning actually is and the general principle behind the mindset that you need to have, as well as the first 3 of the principles that you need to know to organize your ultralearning project.
Principle number... Number 4, drill. And this is kind of in direct contradiction with the previous principle, because now you want to do those algebra drills. The question is, don't do them mindlessly, do them when? So Scott brings in this chemical concept of the rate determining step. In a reaction, sometimes there is one step out of multiple that takes the longest time and that actually determines the rate of the rest of the reaction. So step 1 is really quick, step 3 is really quick, but step 2 is really, really slow. Then if you want to speed up this reaction, you would not focus on step 1 or 3, you would focus on step 2 because that's where the bottleneck is. So Scott says the same thing applies to learning, where one part might be getting you stuck. So if you're making a drawing, maybe you're good with the initial sketch, maybe you're good with filling in the colors, but the line art is where you really get it. So you would focus on making better lines and increasing the quality of your lines. Basically what you do is you identify that bottleneck that takes you the longest time, that rate determining step, and you drill that. You design exercises that target specifically that. So the approach is direct, then drill. So try to practice the skill directly. For example, go and speak to somebody in Japanese. Then you realize that you don't have enough vocabulary. Okay, so go back, learn some vocabulary, and then go and speak again. This time, maybe you realize your grammar kind of sucks. So okay, you go back and you focus on practicing the past tense because you couldn't remember how to do that, or how to do the past negative for verbs, or something specific. You drill that and then you go back in. So back and forth, and always focusing on what you need for direct practice. So when you begin, try to cycle between practice and drills a lot, even within the same learning session. And then the more advanced you get, the longer you need to take these detours into drills, because it will be harder to learn and you need to spend more time actually very actively targeting it. Like a group of muscles in a gym. Tactics. 1 is time slicing, where you identify a specific time frame within a longer sequence of actions. For example, when you're video editing, you might want to focus on just editing the beginning. How do you make the beginning of a video the best it can possibly be? Or the very end, how do you make that the best? Or focus specifically only on transitions between shots. Cognitive components. Try to drill only a specific cognitive component, like vocabulary. The copycat. This strategy is where you copy the parts of the skill that you don't want to drill. For example, if you only want to practice color composition, you would take either an old drawing of yours where you already have the line art or the sketch, or take the line art from somebody else and just make like 10 versions with different colors. The magnifying glass. Spend more time on one component than you would otherwise. If you suck at picking music for videos, spend a lot of time really picking the music and editing the audio. And prerequisite chaining. Start with a skill that you don't have all the prerequisites for. So for example, as I said before, start with calculus, then go back and learn the algebra that you need to know to do that calculus problem. Make sure that you don't drill for nothing. The reason behind doing the direct then drill approach is this provides context for your drills. You know why you need to know this particular thing. 5. Retrieval test to learn. Trying to recall concepts from memory is great for studying. Actually, taking tests is when a lot of your learning happens. By taking a test on material that you previously learned, you learn that material better simply by trying to force yourself to remember it and use it. And interestingly enough, actually taking a test on something you haven't learned yet makes it easier for you to then learn that thing. Literally just the act of reaching into your brain for information makes your brain more ready to accept that information, or digest previously entered information better. Also, another important thing to consider is that we kind of suck at knowing how well we know something. Like, the easier a task is, the more we think we know something. So if we go just by intuition, we will pick the suckiest, crappiest methods for studying because they're the easiest, and if they're the easiest, that means we know things well, and ha ha ha, that makes us feel good. But actually, we need to stick to the hardest things because that is when we learn best. The harder it is, the objectively better you will be at learning something, but the more you're gonna think you don't know it, which you're right, you fucking don't. That's why you're learning it, you dumbass. Just especially this is effective if you combine retrieval with the ability to look up the answers. So doing drills from a math book only for the numbers that you know the answers are in the back of the book. So you do a problem, you look at the answer. You do a problem, you look at the answer. This also gives you feedback, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. What are the tactics for testing yourself? Flashcards work really well, and digital programs like Anki are amazing for things like vocabulary and certain facts where you just need to memorize something, but this only works well when there is a clear pairing between an answer and a question. When there's a clue, for example, the word in your native language and the word in the language that you're learning. Free recall. After you read a section or you sit through a lecture or watch a video, actually try to think to yourself, what did I learn? Say it out loud or write it down. What did I just learn? What can I remember? You're not going to remember a lot, but whatever you write down will actually stick in there. The question book method. As you're listening to a lecture or reading from a textbook, don't write down the answers or typical notes. Instead, phrase everything as questions to be answered later. Instead of writing the circumference of the earth is blah blah blah, write what is the circumference of the earth, and then later try to answer that question when you're reviewing. Cutting off the ability to rely on outside information will make your brain work that much harder and thus make it that much easier to remember and internalize what you've learned. Focus feedback on immediacy, accuracy, and intensity of feedback being given. Some feedback is just not helpful. If you ask your mom, is this drawing good? And she says, yes, sweetie, it's great. That is not going to help you learn any better. It's great, it might make you feel good, it might help your self-esteem, but it's not going to help you draw any better. So there are multiple types of feedback as Scott defines them. Number one is outcome feedback. Are you doing it wrong? This is something like a grade on a test. Informational feedback. What are you doing wrong? And number three is corrective feedback. How can you fix what went wrong? Here's the part you got wrong, and here is a solution that actually shows you how to get it right. Immediate feedback is superior, especially when paired with delayed review. So learn something first, the next day, look over it again, and have immediate feedback as to, is that right, is that wrong, is that right, is that wrong? Tactics for getting good feedback. 1. Noise cancellation. Figure out what feedback is actually helpful. Is it corrective? Is it informational? Does it actually tell you what you got wrong? And more importantly, does it tell you how to fix it? Are there actionable steps that you can take from this feedback? If there aren't, the feedback might not actually be that good and you might want to focus on something else. Meta feedback. Test and figure out which learning strategies that you're using are actually best. Do you learn better when you use this type of testing? Do you learn better when you come up with examples? Do you learn better when you make a mind map? Whatever. And high intensity rapid feedback is the simplest. Just try to get more feedback more often. Maybe get a tutor to bounce things at you. Take more tests. Figure out more problems. 7. Retention. Spacing. Repeat to remember. We forget as a sort of exponential curve. The more time passes, the more we forget and the less we remember, and that decays exponentially. Which means that to not forget, and this I think is scientifically proven, but at least there's a lot of evidence for this, is you will remember best if you practice something again just at the moment when you're about to forget it. So at that moment, it's kind of hard to retrieve, it's kind of uncomfortable, but it's still there and you can still remember it. That prolongs it. And the more you review at these larger spaced intervals, the longer the memory will stay in your brain until eventually it just goes into long-term storage and you'll remember it pretty much forever. And there are actual systems that help you work with this principle called spaced repetition systems. SRS. Anki is one of those. There's a number of language learning applications that use the same principles. Or you can look up suggested intervals and try to space out repetition yourself. This is why it's better to learn things over multiple days as opposed to in a single session. Another principle is proceduralization, which sounds super fancy, but it basically means that the more we practice something, the more intuitive it becomes. Eventually, skills we've practiced enough become second nature. We don't need to really consciously direct effort. When you're first learning how to drive or how to ride a bike, it's really hard. You actually have to consciously focus on it, but as you actually get good at it, it becomes second nature and you can do other things. The space in your brain is freed up to do something else. The same as when you first learn how to add things or how to multiply things. It's really hard. You have no brain space to do calculus. But eventually, as you practice more and more and you do get to calculus, adding and multiplying is something that doesn't take much thought at all. You just do it almost automatically. This is proceduralization. So in order to accomplish this, you need to practice something enough times that it becomes automatic second nature. Overlearning is additional practice that is more than what is required for you to do something. So you might already be getting like 90% of your tests right, but you would practice it more and more and more, and this is tied to proceduralization, so that it allows you to actually get better at something, and practicing it more than that will now help you not learn new skills but remember what you've already learned. And my favorite, mnemonics. Mnemonic devices are amazing, especially for languages. Look it up, find some resources. Mnemonics are basically ways to associate something you're learning with something you already know. They're little tactics to help your brain cling on to new information. For example, the word for shop in Japanese is mise, and you learn this by thinking missing. So you imagine a lot of a store that is completely empty. It's just missing. It went missing one day. So you imagine the store and you think of it. And so the next time somebody asks, what is store in Japanese? I think of the picture of this missing lot and I think missing mise. Number 8. Intuition. So intuition sounds like a super mysterious thing. People who are geniuses have good intuition. They can just look at a problem that's really hard and somehow know the answer, or know when an answer is wrong when nobody else does. But how do they actually get there? Scott argues that intuition is nothing mysterious at all. In fact, intuition is just knowing something so well that it's become procedural, so that you can tackle advanced difficulty and see connections that other people do not see. How do you develop intuition? Tactic number 1, don't give up on problems easily. Set yourself a difficulty timer. Anytime that you get stuck on a problem, set a timer for 10 more minutes to just try it harder and harder and harder. And often you will find that something you thought you couldn't solve at all, you will be able to solve after some time. This is something else that Scott doesn't mention, but I want to mention myself. You can also just take a break. For example, if you're really stuck, go for a walk, go cook, go do something else, go read a book, go watch a video, and then come back to it. Another tactic, prove things to understand them. Actually figure out why things work the way they do. Ask, why do you do this step after this step? Where does this come from? Understand concepts by working through the results and making sure you understand where those results came from. Don't fool yourself. Don't let yourself fall into thinking that you know something that you actually don't. How do you do that? Ask yourself a lot of questions. Ask yourself, why is this? What will happen if this one thing changes? What will happen if this is different? And honestly, the stupider those questions sound, the more helpful they might be, because obvious questions sometimes have less than obvious answers and help you see less than obvious connections between things. Principle number 9, experimentation. This is our last principle, and it is basically putting everything else we've learned together and having fun with it. Try to do things differently. Figure out what are the best things to do this, and this way you expand both your skill set, you have more fun personally, and you expand your ability to transfer things. Number 1, copy, then create. It is very common when learning how to paint to copy paintings by great masters. This way you learn a lot about how things are done, because in order to copy, you need to deconstruct something. This way you figure out how does it work, and that actually helps you learn way better. And then you are ready to apply this in your own situation and create something original. Compare methods side by side. Try to do the same task with 2 different methods. If you're doing a physics problem that has multiple solutions, try to solve it with each solution and then compare which one you like best. Why does this one work better? Why does that one work better? Introduce new constraints. Make old methods impossible to use. How can you make something where you cannot do it the way you usually do. If you usually draw things by starting with an outline, draw without an outline. You just have to. How will you figure it out? Find your superpower in a hybrid of unrelated skills. Instead of becoming the best at one thing where the competition might be really, really tough, become the best at combining two things that are very rarely combined. Very often you will find across multiple ultra-learning projects that things actually make you better at the other thing. By learning how to draw, you might actually become better at creatively writing. Who knows? I don't know, you don't know, you might figure it out the better you get at both things. And explore the extremes, push yourself to the extreme. Try to draw really, really quickly or really, really slowly. See what happens when you have to make a drawing in 10 seconds or 10 hours. So, this is it for principles. You're ready to have your first ultra-learning project. What do you do? 1. Do your research. What are you actually going to learn? What is the subject and what is the approximate scope? For example, you might want to say, I want to learn Japanese and I want to learn it well enough to pass the JLPT N5 exam, the most basic Japanese fluency exam. 2. What are your primary resources? What websites are you using? What textbooks are you using? Are you going to hire a teacher or a tutor? Are you going to be doing anything practical and trying to make a real world project? 3. Benchmark. How did others successfully learn this project? Try to find stories online, try to ask actual experts, go on a forum, go on Reddit, ask, how did you learn this thing? What worked best for you? And then select the answers that you think are the most useful and copy them. 4. What are your direct practice activities? How are you actually going to transfer what you're learning from the abstract into the practical? How are you going to use it? 5. What are your backup materials and drills? When you get stuck on something, where do you go to see a different explanation or more practice problems? You need to define this before you start because you are going to get stuck at some point. 2. Schedule your time. This will depend on external factors and you know what's best. How are you going to learn best? Remember, try to space things out as much as possible, but of course, work within the constraints that you have in your life. 3. Execute your plan. Here are some questions that might be helpful. For meta-learning, have I done my research into what are the typical ways to learn the subject or skill? For focus, how sharp is my attention? What is the best technique I can use to help sustain it? Is it the 5-minute rule, the Pomodoro rule, or scheduling, or is it something else? Directness, how can I apply the knowledge I'm learning from this book, from this lecture, or from this class into something that is actionable? 4. Drill. What is the rate determining step that is holding me back? What is the bottleneck in my learning and how can I target that best so that it doesn't hold me back anymore? Retrieval. Am I spending most of my time reading and reviewing or am I actually actively testing myself on the material and making it harder and harder for me to recall this information, which means I will remember it better? 6. Feedback. Do I actually know what I'm learning well and what I'm not? Do I have a good idea of how I'm doing? 7. Retention. Do I actually have a plan to remember what I'm learning long term? Am I spacing out my sessions? Am I using good tactics? Am I remembering it or am I forgetting everything as soon as I've learned it? 8. Intuition. Could I actually teach this to somebody else? Is it clear why what I'm learning is actually the way it is, or do I have no idea and I'm just accepting things as fact? 9. Experimentation. Am I getting stuck? How can I expand the breadth of my learning as well as depth? 4. Review your results and see how well you did. And 5. Choose how to maintain or master what you've learned. I am going to be designing my own ultra-learning project soon, and I will have an accompanying video, which once it's up, it will be linked to somewhere here. But I will not spoil what that will be. Overall, I loved this book. I really want to apply everything that I've read in here. All right. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, press the subscribe button for more, especially if you want to know what my ultra-learning project will be, and leave a comment down below about what you want to learn and what you thought was the coolest part of this video. Bye bye!